Well, my name is Peter PRONTZOS, Panayotis PRONTZOS. I'll be discussing, in some ways, some similar elements to what Sherry just did. It's going to be fairly broad in a number of ways. I want to start with, I think, one of the most important ideas in the last, say, 10 years, and this is the idea of epigenetics. Successful evolutionary adaptations based on genetic mutations happen at a relatively slow rate. It might take, centuries, thousands of years for genetic change to take place. But we have to adapt, living beings have to adapt more quickly than that because environments can change very rapidly, obviously. So nature has therefore developed a secondary process in which short-term chemical changes can regulate the expression of the genome, essentially switch genes off and on, or even sort of regulate them like a dimmer switch can do. This is epigenetics. My presentation will first explain the nature of epigenetics and how, while it's supposed to be adaptive, it can be maladaptive if a child especially, is exposed to so much harm, so much threat, that the epigenetic changes, while it might help them to survive, can do significant emotional, physical damage, for example. The main emphasis in my paper is on preventing unhealthy epigenetic changes from occurring in the first place, primarily focusing on the social and economic determinants of health, because as we'll see, they are more important in the long run than our individual decisions. But I'd like to start actually dedicating this to my grandparents. This is Rebecca and Argyrios Patsaris. That's on my mother's side. This is Ekaterina and Panayotis PRONTZOS on my father's side. This is the village they came from, Kiparisi, which is just north of Monovasia, which some of you may be familiar with. It's beautiful there. That's my dad and me. Had to do that. Okay. Now, again, reflecting what Sherry was saying, socioeconomic determinants of health, in the long run for most of us, are more important than individual lifestyle changes we might make. And along those lines, one of the most dangerous myths in our society is that of individual self-determination. Like that poem that goes, "I am the master of my fate, I am the captain of my soul." Well, no, it's not even close. Science, whether we're looking at cultural anthropology, social psychology, neuroscience, epigenetics, increasingly demonstrates how we are at the mercy of a host of factors, even before we're born, that are outside of our control. In other words, we need a biopsychosocial perspective. In the words of Gabor Mate, a physician from Vancouver, who's you might be familiar with some of his writings, When the Body Says No, for instance. He points out, from a biopsychosocial perspective, individual biology, psychological functioning, and interpersonal and social relationship all work together and influence each other. We're complicated, Therefore, I'm trying to argue we must abandon the myth that a person's emotional and physical health is primarily dependent on, again, our individual actions. Of course, it's important to eat well, to exercise, to try and be mindful, which is not always easy. But the most powerful determinants, again, are social and economic factors. Things like poverty, as Sherry was talking about, pollution, stressful working conditions, political oppression, lack of free time, patriarchy, violence, limited access to medical care and education. All of these factors outside of the individual can affect an individual and a society's health and length of life. And of all of these, poverty and economic inequality, I believe, are the greatest problems, and we'll see how they affect at the epigenetic level. Another point I want to stress is, while obviously suffering in life is inevitable, the real tragedy is that we create and tolerate much more pain and suffering than is necessary. And this is absolutely fundamental to making any positive change. We have to have a vision. We have to understand that what we have taken for granted, and we maybe want to make some improvements, we can do a whole lot better. We can, in a very short period of time, create a society in which almost everybody can flourish. And I'll go into some details about that shortly. We must also keep in mind, let's see, what Murray Bookchin wrote about 50 years ago, that we already have enough knowledge, enough wealth, enough understanding to create societies which would allow every single person on earth the opportunity to maximize their well-being. Not everybody's going to have a perfect life. There'll be problems. I said, suffering's inevitable, but we tolerate so much more than we need to do. And as Bookchin argued, I don't want to put words in Sherry's mouth, but maybe she has a similar kind of understanding, the existing economic system of global capitalism is the main source of the problems, and it's also ecologically unsustainable. I don't think there's any way that we can have a thriving life form on this planet with a capitalist system which prioritizes profit above everything else. Again, I'm leaving a lot out. This whole presentation is going to be oversimplified. But I'm arguing we need to increase democracy, real control of our lives, and significantly reduce social and economic inequalities. In other words, we have to become active citizens, or political in the ancient Greek sense of the term, to members of our polis, of our communities. So in this presentation, I'll first briefly outline the major biological, psychological, social, economic, and political factors that determine our fates, for better or worse, and then some of the serious challenges we face and how we can overcome them. And I'll start with a quote from the rock band Jefferson Airplane, who said, "I see the people of the world where they are and what they could be." And again, that vision is critical. Part of our method of adaptation is to, after a little while, we might find ourselves in a horrible situation, but we tend to adapt to it. If we find ourselves in poverty or in jail or unemployed or whatever, to a certain extent we have to adapt to it. The problem is if we take that as the new standard and it's much lower. And I'm arguing that our level of what we accept in our lives, and not just in general, in big terms again, about the environment or about poverty, but the stress in our own individual lives. Bertrand Russell, 100 years ago, said if we use the technology we had back then in a rational way, if we weren't wasting it on producing junk that people don't need, on advertising and so on war, the average work week would be down to 20 hours per person. That's it. Imagine having free time. I mean, I'm talking about real concrete goals, not just all the abstract things that we all desire. Okay. I'm going to start briefly with again, all this will be brief, the problem of knowledge. We can learn a lot from The Matrix. The central metaphor of the film, that most of what we think is real is actually an illusion, contains more than a little bit of truth. Keanu Reeves discovers that the world is not what it appears to be, it's in fact a computer-generated illusion. Now, I don't believe that that's the way it is. I can't disprove it. But I think there's a lot of truth to Charles Lamb's observation that we see the world not as it is, but as we are. It's only a slight exaggeration, as we are conditioned. And what's really fascinating is some of the way we look at the world begins in the womb. And with epigenetics, it can actually begin in terms of what happens to our parents and grandparents. And not just in the way their behavior might be passed on to us, but their epigenetic changes, their adaptations to, if they went through a war, for instance, it can be passed on to us, and our bodies react as if we had been through that traumatic experience. I'll give you some examples of those as we go along. Worse, we don't even usually know what we don't know. And what's fascinating is that 99% of all of our thoughts and feelings are unconscious and will remain unconscious. It's what Daniel Kahneman, the Nobel Prize winner, called the fast brain. That's how our ancestors survived over the millions of years. They didn't have a slow, conscious mind to think about things. You had to react quick to survive. That's still most of how our brain works. So all of these factors and more are part of the reason we're driven by situations and forces and perceptions and feelings that we're not even aware of. That's tricky. And as the neuroscientist Cordelia Fine put it, your unconscious is, where's it here? Your unconscious is faster than you and smarter than you. You will never know all of its secrets. But we can do a hell of a lot in spite of that. It's also important to keep in mind that most of our ideas are social constructs. We get our ideas about the world and about ourselves, again, from what we learned from our parents, from the corporate media, from friends, and so on. Albert Einstein was right, not for the first time, when he said that our personalities are largely formed by the environment in which we happen to find ourselves during development, by the structure of society in which we grow up. Society provides us with language, the forms of thought, and most of the content of our thought. And a lot of it makes sense and a lot of it's true, but we need to be, again, mindful and think about it. Is this really true when we're trying to decide about our own lives and other lives? But specifically, Einstein was troubled because, quote, our egotistical drives are constantly being accentuated while our social drives progressively deteriorate. And he said, this crippling of individuals I consider the worst evil of capitalism. Einstein was a socialist, as most of you know. And he said it's not just a matter of labor exploitation and so on. It's how we as individuals are damaged for our entire lives by the kinds of processes, by the kinds of conditioning that we experience under capitalism. For such reasons, we must heed the advice of the philosopher Thales, gnothi safton, know thyself, in order to increase our self-awareness. However, since our views, as I mentioned, are profoundly shaped by social experiences, we must also understand a little bit more about anthropology, social psychology, history, culture, in order to avoid living an unawakened existence. Such a vision, again, that I've talked about, people of the world, when we think about the potential that we have, is essential to making any kind of social change. The next point I want to stress is that we are the most social of all animals. In fact, we're the most social and the most empathetic of all animals. And this is why I'm arguing that we don't need to change human nature to make a better world. It's mostly our environment. If we're put in a different environment, one that actually helps us to thrive, one that encourages cooperation and mutual aid, we will all do better. We don't have to wait for some kind of alien invasion to change our DNA or something. That's why babies cry when they feel alone. They know that they need that kind of social contact. Darwin, who often misunderstood, I've heard that he only once used the term survival of the fittest, and the second time he used it was to say, I didn't mean what they said I said. What he meant was the survival of those who are most social, because he did write that, quote, communities of the most sympathetic members flourish best. I'm just going to leave that on for a few minutes while I continue. We are not the selfish, greedy, narcissistic people that capitalism claims we are. Indeed, as renowned primatologist Franz de Waal observed in his book Primates and Philosophers, life in groups is a survival strategy. That's why we're here, because we're finally attuned to other people's needs, and if we're not damaged and not in a negative environment, we will be empathetic and we will help them out. There was this great experiment. I mean, many of these have been done. This one has babies about 18 months old, and the experimenter is trying to hang clothes up on a clothesline, and the experimenter will drop the clothespin. The babies see that, 18 months, and they all get up, they toddle over, they pick up the clothespin to give it to them. That's, all the evidence shows, that's the natural way we are. We want to help each other. And I should mention one other point. Some people argue that we want to help other people because it makes us feel good, and I think that's backwards, in a sense. When you help somebody you love, you want to help them because you love them, not just to make yourself feel good. It's a way of trying to twist the argument and say we're all, again, really selfish and narcissistic. I don't think the evidence shows that. A related and unique factor in human evolution is cooperative breeding. This is the expression that Sarah Hardy uses for the communal child rearing that helped to make our extended lifespans, prolonged childhoods, and bigger brains possible. Because parents could rely on what she calls allomothers, from the Greek word for other. In other words, other mothers, fathers, grandparents, cousins, friends, who would help raising the children. It wasn't that you had just one woman and she had all the responsibility for raising the kids. That's difficult for any one person to do. In fact, it's probably impossible. But that's not the way we evolved. Um, One example, I think, of how closely our emotional attitudes and connections are, how important they are, is that the same parts of our brain that process physical pain process emotional pain. That's why emotional pain can drive people to suicide and all kinds of terrible things. Our pain is a signal from our bodies telling us we have to pay attention. Something is not right. It could be, again, physical pain, you cut yourself, or social pain because you're isolated, because people dump on you, or any of these things, and we need other people to be healthy. So the pain is telling us we need to pay attention. Another point that I think is critical, I heard the psychologist Dan Siegel speak at UCLA a few years ago, and he said that the self, yourself, everybody's self, has three components: your brain, your body, and other people. And it's not a metaphor. It's not, other people shape moment to moment how we feel, literally how our brain functions, and the kinds of chemicals that are released into our brain. Our experiences from moment to moment change the synapses and the connections in our brain. We are profoundly affected by other people. He talks about how we exchange energy and information with other people that we're with all the time. Again, most of it's unconscious, but it affects us and it gets into our brain function. It's not trivial. Dr. Marty Glenn in California explains that, going back to the basics here, that the events and the environment surrounding preconception, in other words, for example, is the mother, even before she's pregnant, is she getting proper medical care, proper food? Is she overly stressed or whatever? Preconception, pregnancy, birth, and early infancy set out the template on which we live our lives. But of course, thanks to infantile amnesia, we don't remember those things. In a sense, our body does, but we don't have a conscious memory. Before we're born, we have a need to develop an environment which provides both the nutrients and the safety for healthy growth. A fetus can be damaged if the mother is overly stressed from poverty or malnutrition, or from contact with even small amounts of toxins or air pollution. In fact, there was a study in Canada showing that if babies who were in the womb near busy intersections where there's lots of air pollution from automobiles had an increased risk of childhood leukemia that was 400% above average. Now, wealthy people don't usually buy homes near polluted intersections. It's a socioeconomic issue. Before we're born, we need to develop an environment which provides nutrients and safety, as I mentioned. These conditions are also correlated later in life with heart disease, diabetes, child obesity, and aggression, and a whole host of other factors. Lower IQ and risk for depression can all start in the womb. It may not be enough to condemn you to that, but it's a start in the wrong direction. As Dr. Robinson wrote, what we have found is that regardless of exposure to stress in the womb, a nurturing environment after birth can provide the child with the enormous potential to change their course of development. That's something that's critically important. However badly, more or less, you start out, you still have time. There's developmental plasticity, where children, even if their mother had gone through a period of being hungry or trauma through war or something, a lot can be done. Which means that the brain can adapt and change as the child grows with a positive environment. The important message here is how we as a community support pregnant women. If we think about the people who lead stressful lives, they are the most often linked with socioeconomic disadvantage. That brings us to epigenetics specifically. And again, it's not that our DNA changes, but the chemicals that can turn the DNA off or on or regulate how much it's expressed, that can change in a very, very short period of time. University of British Columbia researcher Michael Corbor defines epigenetics as, quote, the persistent and heritable alterations in genome information that do not involve changes in the DNA sequence. And it's interesting to remember, all our cells have the exact same DNA. but it's the environment they find themselves in that activates some DNA to turn some cells into bone cells, some into neurons, and so on. But every cell starts out exactly the same. Michael Meany, one of the most important researchers when it comes to epigenetics at McGill University, has found that intense childhood experience, especially parents' behavior, can act like a dimmer switch, again, changing the gene function. And he said, quote, parental care does affect the activity of genes in the brain that regulate the stress response. It can create structural change in the DNA and affect its expression. And he adds that, again, this in a way ties back to what Sherry was saying, the development of an individual is an active process of adaptation that occurs within a social and economic context. That is, poverty increases maternal distress and poor parenting, which then leads to lower cognitive outcomes for children. And this is the most important factor when it comes to looking at the passing on epigenetic effects. On the other hand, as I mentioned, it can be passed on from your parents and grandparents. There was a study in the Swedish town of Överkalix that found, for example, that if a man suffered food shortages when he was 8 to 12 years old, his son's sons were more likely to die young. If a woman suffered food shortages as a child, her son's daughters were more likely to die young. In Överkalix, this was a very northern Sweden, and they kept very good records. And this was like, 100 years ago when sometimes there would be a food shortage. And they could trace these short famines with epigenetic effects, and in this case, death in grandchildren. Another study there found that if a man overate in childhood, his son's children were 4 times more likely to develop diabetes and cardiovascular disease because the epigenetic effects were passed on to his children and his children's children. The message is simple. The healthier that our lives are, the healthier our children's lives will be. Specific gene expression, in other words, the phenotype that's expressed, is determined by the interaction of these 3 primary factors: genes, the epigenes, and the environment. So essentially, you bring in the DNA with you. It interacts with the environment. Is it positive and healthful, or is it damaging? And that changes the epigenetic expression, which then, of course, can have an effect on the environment itself, back and forth, in a sort of a dialectical way. Meany just did a report on a study last month, which showed that when it comes to some of the outcome studies, while 25% of differences in the populations that they were looking at could be due to genetics, 75% were due to the gene-environment interaction. Another insight into the importance of our experience was provided by Robert Sapolsky. He's a neurobiologist at Stanford, and there was a great documentary about him that the National Geographic did called Stress, Portrait of a Killer. And in it, he talks about how, again, stress can get inside of us. And he makes a very important point. He says, some people are born with, I think it's the 5-HTT gene, which used to be thought was tied to depression. And first of all, what he found was people that had this gene did not get depressed always. They only were depressed in certain environments, in environments that were stressful, environments where they didn't get enough food and so on. Later research found that if you had this particular gene, it was not that you were predisposed to being depressed. It meant you were more, as a person, you were more in touch with your environment. So in a healthy environment, people with that gene were actually healthier and happier than people who didn't have it. So it increased your sensitivity to the environment. It wasn't a case of genetic determinism that you were bound to be either happier or unhappier. Again, as Meany notes, what happens in our early years becomes biologically embedded in the individual and influences health and capacity over the lifetime. Again, biologically embedded means, for example, you're more likely to have a high stress reaction to a very minor event. And one of the things that happens then when your body goes into fight or flight, it tends to shut down your immune system. Again, Sapolsky shows this in the film. He said when our ancestors were evolving in the savannas of Africa and a lion came after us, you didn't need to digest food, you know. You didn't need to have a good immune system. All the energy had to be into escaping from the lion. And if you did, you were fine. If you didn't, well, it didn't matter. But when we're constantly stressed, which is a very common situation, I think probably for most people, then our immune systems are lower and we're more prone to disease. Actually, I think it was, Sapolsky also showed that there was a study done in orphanages in the U.S. maybe 70, 80 years ago. And they found that in orphanages where they gave them, food and kept them warm, but there was no social interaction, in all the hospitals they looked at, 9 out of 10 children died. And they died because their immune systems were so overloaded that just getting a common cold or anything would overwhelm them. They couldn't continue. Michael Korbor, also at UBC, explains that social epigenetics, quote, explores the mechanisms by which diverse factors such as family income, parental behavior, child rearing practices, and environmental toxins exert their effect by altering, again, the expression of our genes. Babies are especially vulnerable to epigenetic damage in detrimental social and economic environments. And as Meany emphasizes, brain development and function are regulated by the social environment. And finally, the development of an individual is an active process of adaptation that occurs within a social and economic context. And those things that happen to us we're generally unconscious about. We're not even aware of it. Again, or we adjust to it and we think it's normal to feel stressed, and it becomes just background. It's normal to be depressed. That's just the way it is. And you have no other reference as to, no, I shouldn't feel this way. This is not normal. This is not healthy. Children raised in unfavorable socioeconomic circumstances show increased susceptibility to chronic diseases of aging in their 5th and 6th decades of life. One of the most important findings was that, and this was done in research by UC Berkeley and UBC in Vancouver, that children from, quote, low socioeconomic environments displayed a response in the prefrontal cortex similar to the response of people who had a portion of their frontal lobes destroyed by a stroke. That's how serious poverty can damage your brain. But as Meany also points out and emphasized, that it's not bad parenting or stress in the family that's the main problem. It's poverty that causes the stress. So, and again, it's not that every poor family is going to stress out their children and have these problems, but it's obviously a lot more likely when, again, it's not rocket science, when the parents are worried about providing food and a home for their children, if they don't have time to spend with their children, if they can't read to them, if they can't take them to the park and so on.